The pup didn't come to Eamon Doyle gentle, the way good things are supposed to. He came at the black bottom of a January gale, wedged into a busted lobster crate behind the old fish store on the far side of Tibbs Harbour, where the wind off the strait could lift the paint clean off a dory, and the cold went hunting for the soft parts of a man on purpose. One photo, one message, that was all it took to drag a retired soldier off the Chesterfield, where he had been quietly turning himself to stone for the better part of 2 winters. He thought he was going out to bury something. He had no notion that a half-drowned scrap of fur, no bigger than a loaf of bread, was about to give him back the one thing the desert and the cancer ward had between them stolen. The feeling that a house with the lights on could be a home. Stay to the end and watch how it happened, slow and stubborn, the way real mending always goes. And if there's still a soft place in you for second chances, do stay and think about subscribing, so we can keep bringing you these stories of loyalty, faith, and the long road back. Snow had been falling on the west coast of Newfoundland since the middle of the afternoon. Fine and mean, the kind that doesn't drift so much as fly sideways and find your collar. Eamon Doyle sat in the front room of the saltbox house his grandfather had built, a mug of tea gone cold in both hands, and listened to the long-range mountains hum behind the storm. He was 53, broad through the shoulders still, though the muscle had gone quieter on him, and his hair had turned the color of wet ash. He kept it cropped close, not out of vanity, but out of an old habit his hands hadn't unlearned. There was a stillness to him that strangers mistook for calm. It wasn't calm. It was the held breath of a man who had spent 22 years in uniform. The last 6 of them with a unit he wasn't supposed to name out loud, learning that the safest thing a person could do with a feeling was lock it in a footlocker and sit on the lid. The house was clean and it was bare, and both of those facts were on purpose. A wood stove, a Chesterfield, a kitchen table scrubbed to the grain. On the windowsill, face down, lay a photograph in a wooden frame because there were 2 faces in it. Eamon could not yet look at and go on breathing, his wife Maeve, 2 years gone to a thing that ate her up over 11 months, and beside her, grinning the way only working dogs grin, a Belgian Malinois named Atlas. Atlas had been his partner across 3 deployments. Atlas had put his own body between Eamon and a doorway in a country full of bad doorways, and Eamon had carried what was left of him out under fire, and he had been carrying it ever since. He did not think of himself as a man who had come home. He thought of himself as a man the war had let leave. The phone buzzed on the arm of the Chesterfield, and he nearly didn't look. Then it buzzed again. It was Tess Hollett. Everyone on this stretch of shore knew Tess. Mid-40s, square-built, cheeks scoured red by 100 winter rescues, chestnut hair shoved up under a wool toque that had seen better decades. She'd run the animal rescue out of Corner Brook for going on 16 years, driving roads that the plows gave up on, hauling cats out of culverts and tied up dogs out of yards where nobody loved them. She didn't believe in mercy as a warm feeling. She believed in it as a thing you put your boots on for at 9 o'clock at night in a whiteout. Her message was short. Pup locked in a crate behind the abandoned store on Scary Point Road. Somebody heard it crying. Storm's only getting worse, Eamon. It won't see morning. You're closest. Underneath was a picture, and Eamon stopped breathing the way he used to stop breathing before a door went in. A pup. Some kind of shepherd and husky muddle, by the look of him. Maybe 10 weeks, maybe 12. Black and silver, soaked through, one ear up, and the other folded soft against his skull, like a question nobody had answered. His ribs showed plain. Beside him a tin bowl was frozen to a solid disk. But it was the eyes that pinned Eamon to the chair. Pale, a wolfish blue-gray, and not wild with panic the way you'd expect. Empty in a particular way Eamon recognized, because he had seen that exact look in a mirror in a base hospital and had spent the years since pretending he hadn't. It was the look of a creature that had already asked the world for help once and learned what the world thought of that. He put the phone down. He stood up. He sat back down. No, he said to the empty room, very low. He'd made himself promises. No more running toward what was already breaking. No more midnight calls. He'd done his service. He'd carried his dead. A man was allowed, surely to God, to be left alone with his ghosts in a warm house at the edge of the sea. But the quiet that came after he said no was worse than the storm. Because it was the same quiet that had filled the house when Maeve's breathing finally stopped. and the same quiet that had ridden home with him from overseas, in a seat that should have held a dog. He looked once more at the small soaked thing behind the wire, waiting on the world to make up its mind about him. Then he got his oilskin coat off the hook by the door, and his good gloves, and the heavy flashlight, and he went out into it. The drive was slow and it was vicious. The old Ford slewed on the harbor road, headlights catching nothing but snow coming at the glass like static. Past the wharf, past the boarded-up store, the road narrowed to a single mean track between black spruce bent double under the weight of the storm. Eamon's gloved hands held the wheel the way they'd once held a rifle, too tight, the body remembering. He told himself it was only a dog, only a small life in a world that was nothing but small lives losing. But some piece of him that the war had failed to kill knew better. Sometimes one small life was the only holy thing a person was offered all winter, and a man turned away from it at the cost of his own soul. The fish store stood half-fallen behind a sagging fence, its roof bowed under snow, its gray clapboards split like old bone. Eamon killed the engine and stepped out, and the cold hit him in the teeth. He went around the back, boots punching through the crust, until he heard it under the wind. A thin, broken sound, not quite a cry, more like the place where a cry runs out of strength. He hauled a sheet of frozen plywood aside, and there was the crate. The pup was shaking so hard the wire sang. Around his throat under the wet fur, Eamon's flashlight found the worn marks of an old rope, and something in his jaw went hard as a stone. "Easy, Bee," he said, and his voice came out lower and steadier than he felt. "I'm not here to hurt you. Not me." The latch was rusted shut. He fetched a pry bar from the truck and struck it twice, and the latch gave, and the crate door swung loose into the snow. The pup did not bolt. He only stared, as if an open door were one more trick the world had taught him not to fall for. Eamon crouched and put out one bare hand, ignoring the bite of the cold up his fingers, and waited. A long time he waited. Then the pup leaned forward an inch, and touched his nose to Eamon's palm. That small warmth nearly took the legs out from under him. He folded the pup inside his oilskin, against his chest, and felt a heartbeat going far too fast and far too brave, and he carried it to the truck like a man carrying something out of a fire. On the road home, the storm blurred everything to white. The pup lay shivering on the bench seat, alive, and through a gap in the snow, Eamon caught the old sign that marked the turn for the headland, Scary Point, and the lighthouse out on it that had guided boats home long before he was born. He looked at the small gray scrap of life beside him, and something inside him that had been seized up for 2 winters shifted, not loose, but moved. "Beacon," he said. It came up out of him before he decided to say it. "The light that brings you in off the water when you can't see your own hand. We'll try that on you, Beacon." Under the howl of the gale, the name didn't sound like a label. It sounded like a promise a man had no business making, and made anyway. Morning came gray to Tibbs Harbor, no warmth in it, only a pale shine off the new snow. Eamon hadn't so much slept as kept watch, back to the wall, knees up, eyes on the small bundle breathing by the wood stove. By daylight, Beacon looked smaller than he had in the crate. Narrow shoulders, paws too big for him, that one stubborn ear standing up while the other lay flat, as if his own body couldn't agree whether to be brave. Every little while the pup twitched at some dream, and then settled when the heat found his ribs. Eamon watched each rise and fall of that thin chest, with the grim attention of a sentry at the last gate of a fallen kingdom. When Beacon opened his eyes, he didn't bark, and he didn't whine. He only looked at Eamon, weighing him, trying to decide if this quiet man was shelter or just another shape of trap. Mornin' Eamon said, rough from disuse, "We made it through, the 2 of us." The word we surprised him. He'd been an eye so long that even the furniture had got used to it. By mid-morning, he had Beacon wrapped in an old wool sweater, and was driving him in to the clinic on the edge of Corner Brook, the bay road glazed, and the mountains standing off in the cloud like sleeping things. The clinic was a low cedar building with a green roof and a sign cut in the shape of a paw. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and old coffee and the wild musk of frightened animals. And behind the counter stood a woman Eamon took the measure of in about 4 seconds, and decided he could trust, which was not a thing he did anymore. Dr. Robin Pike was 38, lean, fair, with a spray of freckles across her nose and dark hair pulled back in a braid that had been done in a hurry. There was a steadiness to her that no emergency seemed able to rattle, and a small white scar across the back of one thumb, the mark of some older rescue that had bitten before it understood it was being saved. "You'd be Eamon," she said, coming round slow so as not to startle the pup. "Tess called ahead, said you found him off Scary Point." He set Beacon on the padded table with the care of a man laying down something that might break. "Locked in a crate. No food I could see. Water froze solid. There's rope marks on his neck, older than the crate." Her mouth tightened, not with shock, just the worn-down anger of someone who'd watched human cruelty walk in too many doors. "All right, old son," she murmured, dropping to the pup's eye level. "You did the hard part. You stayed alive. We'll handle the rest." Beacon stiffened when she touched him, but Dr. Pike moved like she had all the time God made, every pause on purpose. She checked his gums, his pads, the skin under the matted fur, and Eamon stood by with his arms crossed and his jaw locked so tight the muscle jumped. He had stood under live fire with less showing on his face than he showed now, watching a thermometer. "Breathe, Mr. Doyle," she said, not unkindly. "He's some thin and he's some scared, but he's not giving up on us." She straightened. 10-12 weeks. Underfed, dried out, a touch of frost starting on the pads, but we caught that early. No bones broke. The rope marks are the older hurt. That fear'll take longer to mend than the cold ever would. "Will he come right?" Eamon asked. "In his body, yes." She looked at him a second longer than the question needed. "In the rest of him, that depends on what happens to him next." Before he could answer, a back door swung open and a big man came through with an armload of towels. Lorne Pelly was somewhere in his late 50s, broad in the chest and thick in the middle, iron-gray hair cropped close, a square weathered face under a permanent gray stubble. He'd fished 40 years out of this harbor and skippered the volunteer fire brigade besides, until a winch let go and took most of the use out of his left leg. He walked with a creak and a limp and a complete refusal to be bitter about either. "This the prisoner Tess hauled out of the gale?" Lorne looked at the pup and shook his head slow. "God love him. Big ears, no meat on him, worst possible timing. Reminds me of every green hand I ever took aboard." "Lorne," said Dr. Pike. "What?" "I'm paying him a compliment." And for the first time since the night before, something loosened in Eamon's chest. Not a laugh. But the place a laugh comes from, remembering where it was. Dr. Pike sent them home with fluids, a few days of soft food, and a list of rules in her neat hand. Small meals often. Warmth, but not too much. No grabbing, no looming, no big voices. "Let him come to you," she'd said. "A creature that's been caged needs choices a good deal more than it needs commands." And as she packed the bag, she took from a drawer a plain brown leather collar, sturdy and soft, and pressed it into his hand. Not today. Someday when he stops seeing anything round his neck as a threat. "I want you to have it now, mind, so you understand what it has to mean before he ever wears it. For a dog like this one, a collar can't be control. It has to be the other thing." She paused. "Belonging." Eamon turned the leather over in his palm and felt the weight of it, which had nothing to do with leather. That evening he set the collar on the windowsill, next to the photograph still lying face down. The dead and the living, side by side on a narrow board. A friend and a wife he couldn't yet face, and a small breathing thing he'd somehow been handed to keep. Then he sat on the floor a careful arm's length from the wood stove, close enough to guard, far enough not to crowd, and for the first time in 2 years the silence in the salt box had a sound braided through it. A pup, breathing. He didn't feel, that night, like a man hiding in a house. He felt like a man who had brought somebody home. The days after the clinic went the way snow leaves the eaves, one slow drop at a time. Eamon found that pulling Beacon out of the crate had been the easy part, the loud part, the part a soldier's body understood. The hard work came after, in the long quiet hours when nobody was watching, and courage looked less like breaking a latch, and a great deal more like setting a bowl on the floor and stepping back and waiting. He boiled chicken until the whole house smelled of broth and tore it into shreds, and softened it with a bit of rice, and set it down by the stove, then crossed to the far side of the room and sat with his hands where they could be seen. "Your call, old man," he'd murmur. Beacon would sniff the air, and hunger would pull him one way and old fear the other, and for a long moment he'd stand frozen at the fork in himself like a traveler on a haunted road. Then he'd take one trembling step. 2. Eat 3 mouthfuls, look up to check that the man hadn't moved, eat 2 more, and back off as if ashamed of needing anything at all. Eamon started writing it down. In an old waterproof field notebook he'd carried overseas, its cover cracked, its corners soft from years of being jammed in a pocket. Once it had held grid references and frequencies and the cold arithmetic of getting men home alive. Now it held quieter dispatches. Day 3, drank without shaking. Day 4, ate while I stayed in the room. Day 6, looked at my hand and did not flinch off. The first few felt foolish, scratched there by a man who'd planned night operations down to the second. But each line warmed something. He wasn't commanding this dog, he was witnessing him, and that small distinction undid Eamon worse than he'd have credited, because for 22 years he'd believed strength was control. Control the room, control the breath, control the fear before it controlled you. Beacon knew nothing of any of that. Beacon got better only when he was let to choose. It was a humbling thing to be schooled in patience by a creature that weighed less than a turkey. The first knock changed everything, the way knocks do. It came on the 7th morning, firm, and Beacon shot under the kitchen table. Eamon's spine was at the door before his mind caught up, and he opened it to find Effie Roche from down the lane. 74 years old, small and slightly bent, silver hair pinned up neat as a sundae, blue eyes still full of more mischief than a woman her age had any right to. She held a covered plate in both mittened hands, and the smell coming off, it was butter and cinnamon and something deeper. "I heard," she announced. "There was an invalid up here. Couldn't make out from the talk was it you or the dog, so I brought Teutons enough for the both of ye, and a few partridge-berry buns besides." He took the plate. He could not have said no to her if his life hung on it. She didn't bend down to the pup, didn't reach. She lowered herself into the kitchen chair like a queen, taking a throne she'd had her eye on, pulled off one glove, and let her bare hand rest open and still on her knee. "My Albert had a shepherd, after he came back from the merchant navy," she said, to nobody in particular, to the room. "That dog knew the nightmares were coming before Albert did. Used to get up on his chest in the night like a sandbag with opinions." She glanced sidelong at the man and her voice gentled. "Animals hear the storm inside us, Eamon Doyle. 'Tis why the good Lord made them without the gift of gossip." Beacon took one step toward her, then another. He sniffed her wool sleeve, her open fingers, and very carefully touched his tongue once to her knuckle. Effie's eyes filled, and she laughed anyway, because some people will not give tears the whole room. "Well, sure," she said. "There it is, I've been chose." Eamon's throat closed over. That night he wrote, went to Effie on his own. Then, after a long pause with the pen not moving, he added a second line he'd never have written a month before. "I spoke to someone and did not once wish them gone. The cold held on, the way it does out here." Trucks ground past on the harbour road, and Beacon still scrambled for the dark under the table whenever a door slammed downwind, and Eamon's own pulse still leapt like a hunted thing when the old stovepipe banged in the night. Neither of them was cured, but Effie's buns brought the next caller, and that brought the next, and Eamon was learning that mending was not a door flung wide all at once. It was a crack of light under the frame. It was the pup eating 5 bites instead of 3. It was the man leaving the photograph face down on the sill but no longer turning his whole body away from it when he passed. The real test came with the first big nor'easter of February, the kind that comes up off the strait without the courtesy of a warning. Eamon had just warmed the supper when the thunder of it hit, not summer thunder, but the deep concussive boom of sea ice heaving, and the wind hammering the south wall like a fist. Beacon dropped flat at once, legs scrabbling on the boards, both ears down, and bolted for the table. And Eamon froze with the spoon in his hand, because his body had not heard Tibbs Harbour. His body had heard a road outside Kandahar. It heard metal tearing. It heard grit in his teeth. It heard the sound Atlas made, once, only once, and then the silence after, the silence he had been carrying home in his chest for 6 years like a stone he could not set down. The spoon slipped and rang in the bowl. A second crack came, closer, rattling the windows, and an old mug walked off the edge of the counter and shattered on the floor, and for one terrible second Eamon Doyle was not in Newfoundland at all. He was back under a burning sky, holding a dog that had already gone, and refusing to know it. Then he heard Beacon whimper. It was thin and small and nearly lost under the wind on the glass, and it reached a place reason could not. The kitchen came back in pieces, stove, table, broke mug, Pup under the table shaking. Eamon lowered himself to the floor, slow every move on purpose. He did not crawl toward the dog. He remembered the doctor's words, and thought that maybe a frightened man needed the same medicine as a frightened animal. Choices, and no looming. "Easy now, Beacon," he said, though his own voice shook at the edges. "'Tis only weather. Loud old weather is all." He sat cross-legged a few feet off, palms open on his knees, and made himself breathe the way he'd once taught younger men to breathe under fire. In through the nose, hold it, out slow, slow enough that the body remembers it's alive. The wind threw itself at the house. The pipes groaned in the walls like the house itself was afraid, and Eamon kept breathing, and after a while Beacon's shaking changed. It didn't stop, but it lost the wildness in it. The pup stretched his neck out, sniffed, drew back. Eamon looked away a little, to give him the gift of not being watched. Time passed in that strange holy slowness only fear makes. At last Beacon crawled out, one paw's length and then another, belly low to the floor, and came to Eamon's leg, and went past it to the bare forearm where his sleeve had ridden up. And there, pale against the skin, ran the old shrapnel scar, the crooked line from the same road, the same day, the same dog. Beacon put his nose to it, warm, careful, solemn almost, as if he had found the buried wound by its smell alone and meant to keep watch over it. Eamon's breath caught hard in his chest. A broken sound came out of him that was not quite a laugh. "You got some aim on you, B," he managed. The pup didn't understand the words. He understood the tone. He lay down against Eamon's knee, not fully touching, but close enough that their breathing slid after a while into the same rhythm. And for the first time since that road, Eamon did not shove the memory away. He sat with it. He sat with Atlas, and the thunder, and the living dog at his side. The fear did not die like a villain in a story. It just found a smaller chair to sit in. When the storm wore down to plain hard rain, Eamon got up and swept the broken mug. Beacon watched from the table but did not hide. "That was my good mug," Eamon told him, holding the two halves together. "Don't be looking at me." It had character. Beacon blinked at him, and for reasons he couldn't have defended, Eamon smiled. The next clear morning he loaded the pup in the truck and drove out to the little pond below Scary Point, where the spruce leaned over the water, and the lighthouse stood white against a hard blue sky. To show him the world still ran on after thunder. Beacon stepped down onto the gravel nose first, suspicious of every sound. A raven up in the branches, the slap of water on stone, a snowmobile droning off somewhere across the barrens. Eamon let him set the pace. At the edge of the pond the pup stretched one paw to the shallow water, met the cold, snatched it back, glared at the pond as if it had insulted his people, then leaned in again with such comic seriousness that Eamon had to look away to keep his face straight. Beacon put both front paws in, sneezed, leapt back, and out of his narrow chest came a sound. Not a bark, exactly. A husky's sound. A warbling, rising, ridiculous half-howl, the kind of full-throated talking back that the breed is famous for, cracking in the middle like a youngster's voice. It rolled out over the pond and the trees and the whole gray-blue morning. Eamon stared, then laughed so hard it nearly hurt. Beacon, startled by the approval, did it again, louder, as though announcing himself to the lighthouse and the ravens and every ghost that had ever mistaken a man's silence for surrender. "There he is," Eamon said, his eyes stinging in the wind. "There's your voice, B." The rumor started, the way rumors do out here, with Effie Roche. By the time she'd carried the tail down the lane it had grown legs and run off without her. And by supper time, according to Lorne, the pup wasn't merely making noise. He was greeting the elderly, answering questions, and very possibly forecasting the weather. If he starts in collecting the church dues, Lorne said, "I'm done. He'd be gentler about the overdue ones than Father is." It was the youngsters who really made it real. 3 of them turned up at the door one Saturday like pilgrims at the mouth of a cave where a dragon was rumored to bide. Declan Roche, Effie's great-grandson, 10 and all elbows, with a scribbler held like a reporter's notepad. His sister Brigid, 8, 2 dark braids and the grave face of a small schoolteacher, and little Sadie from the blue house by the wharf, 6, strawberry curls escaping a too big toque, her mittens shaped like kittens. "Mr. Doyle," Declan said, breathless. "Great Nan says your dog talks." Eamon looked down at Beacon, who had got himself halfway behind a boot but had not run. "Your great Nan says a great many things. Does he say real words?" Brigid pressed. "No," he said, and Sadie's lower lip went, and Eamon, who had faced down armed men with a steady pulse, found himself entirely undone by the threat of a 6-year-old's tears. "But," he added quickly, "he answers polite now and again. That was enough." The youngsters straightened with awe. Sadie, because the shy ones are so often the bravest, put out one kitten mitten, palm up. "Hello, Beacon," she whispered, and Beacon stretched his neck and gave one soft warbling roo, so perfectly timed it might have been rehearsed, and the porch came apart in delighted shrieks. From that day, Beacon was the talking dog of Tibbs Harbor. The children learned to come soft. No yelling, no grabbing, that rule was iron. And Beacon learned that small humans smelled of crayons and peanut butter and wild hope, and that Sadie always moved slow, that Bridget explained everything twice, and that Declan asked his questions like he was readying a witness for the stand. With every careful greeting, the pup stood a little taller. And the strangest thing happened, which Eamon hadn't bargained for at all. As Beacon answered the harbor started answering Eamon. Effie's plates came regular. Lorne dropped by under the thin pretense of checking the woodpile. The youngsters waved from the wharf. The salt box had stopped being a bunker pretending to be a house. People knocked on it now. He carved a little sign for the door, slow and patient the way he'd learned to do everything. "Speak soft. Beacon may answer." Effie inspected it and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she swore was for the cold. It was the middle of March, with the sea ice still in, and a sly squall riding down off the long range, that the phone went mad again. The harbor group chat lit up message after message. "Gus is loose." Nuala's little Gus took off after the plow toward the wharf. "Ice is bad past the slip. Finn is beside himself." "Anyone close?" Eamon's face changed in the quiet way Beacon had learned to read, the softness leaving the mouth, the shoulders squaring. Somewhere under the retired man in the wool sweater, the old operator stood up out of his chair, like a shadow called back to its work. Nuala Green lived 2 coves over, a young mother with a 5-year-old, Finn, and a small, scruffy terrier named Gus. That Finn loved the way only a lonely child loves the one creature that's always glad to see him. Beacon was already on his feet. Both ears up. "You heard that," Eamon said. The pup gave one low sound, not fear this time, readiness. He grabbed the harness and the long line, and his hand went past the brown collar on the sill, the one he still hadn't fastened, because it hadn't been earned, not yet. Out into it they went. The squall had stolen the daylight early, and the wind off the strait came in raw enough to find every gap in a man's clothes. Down at the slip stood Nuala, hatless, her hair stuck to a face raw with cold and crying, a torn strip of red leash twisted in one hand. Beside her, big as a barn and twice as steady, stood Lorne, who had got there first. "We've been at the road and the picnic shelter both," Lorne said low. "No sign. He went out toward the rough ice, Eamon. I don't love it. He's only ever been a little dog his whole life," Nuala said, the words tumbling. "He thinks he's a wolf. Finn keeps asking, is Gus cold? I can't." Her voice broke clean across the middle. "Give Beacon the leash," Eamon said. She knelt in the snow and held out the torn red strip, and the pup, who was still half pup, changed in front of her. He took the scent once, then again, longer, and the youngster went out of him. The dog, who'd trembled behind wire, put his nose to the ground with a sudden terrible purpose, and the long line drew tight. "He's got something," Eamon said. Lorne kept Nuala back with a hand near her elbow. A frightened owner makes more noise than the church bell, made. And Eamon followed Beacon out past the slip, onto the shore where the snow had drifted hard against the broken rail of the old stage. The pup swept low, lifted his head to take the wind, swept low again. A spruce branch cracked under Eamon's boot, and Beacon flinched, but did not stop. Eamon's chest went tight with a thing he eventually recognized, with some surprise as pride. Then the pup froze, ears up, and from somewhere ahead came a sound so thin it nearly wasn't there. A high shivering whine. Beacon barked once, sharp and clear, and lunged toward a slumped place in the old rail where the ice ran out over black water. And there was Gus, small, soaked, fox-faced, terrified, his trailing leash hooked fast on a splintered post, and his back legs gone through a skin of rotten ice at the very edge of the deep, every struggle widening the crack with a sound like a finger drawn across glass. "Easy, Gus, easy now." Eamon went down flat on the snow to spread his weight, the way the cold and the years and the old training came back to him, not as violence, but as something patient. He worked the leash off the post, then the little dog's legs free of the broken ice, the cold biting through his gloves until a thin line of blood opened across one knuckle. He paid it no mind. The ice gave a long warning crack, and Beacon, beside him, set his feet and let out a low growl straight at the water itself. "I hear it," Eamon muttered. "I know." Gus kicked in his terror and slid an inch toward the black. Eamon moved faster than a man his age had any business moving, got a hand under the little dog's chest, and hauled him back against his coat. And for one held breath the whole world stopped. And then the terrier was in his arms, shaking, safe. Beacon barked again, fierce and bright, and up the shore Nuala cried out. She took Gus from Eamon's arms and folded around him, sobbing into his wet fur while the little fool licked her chin as if to apologize for the whole adventure. Then she turned and knelt right down in the snow in front of the pup and touched 2 fingers to his chest. "Thank you," she said to him. "Thank you, Bee." Beacon looked at her and gave one soft, polite roo, and Lorne Pelly turned away to scrub at his eyes with the back of a glove. "Well?" he said, gone hoarse. Seems the talking dog had something worth saying after all. By the time they came back up the lane, the word had run ahead of them. Effie stood at her gate wrapped in a quilt, crying openly and pretending the wind was at fault. The youngsters burst out with a sign painted in crooked marker, "Beacon, Hero Dog," and Sadie had drawn a crown over his name. Beacon looked at the sign, looked at the children, and let out a long, ridiculous, glorious warble, and the youngsters screamed with joy, and swore up and down he'd said "You're welcome." Lorne arrived a few minutes on with a thermos of cocoa from the diner and the firm opinion that, by law of the shore, heroes and their handlers were owed chocolate. That night, after the harbor settled and the pup lay sleeping by the stove, Eamon Doyle did 2 things he had not been able to do in 2 long winters. He took the brown collar down off the windowsill, and from the drawer where he kept what was left of his old life, he lifted out Atlas's dog tag, worn smooth, the stamped letters going faint, and threaded it onto the collar's ring, where it gave a small clear chime like a buoy bell far out in the dark. He knelt. Beacon woke and stood and did not back away. He lifted his head, thin chest steady, those pale eyes calm on the man. Eamon fastened the collar gently round his neck. The tag settled against the silver fur. "There now," he said very low. "You belong here, and you carry him, the once fellow who carried me. He'd have liked you. God, he'd have run you ragged." His voice went and he let it. "You're home." Beacon pressed his forehead into Eamon's shoulder and held it there, and in that bare, warm room under the mountains, the rescued dog became family. And one thing more. Before he turned in, Eamon went to the sill and picked up the photograph that had lain face down for 2 years. He wiped the dust from the glass with his thumb. Maeve laughing at something off to the side the way she always was. Atlas grinning his working dog grin. He stood the frame up, facing into the room, and let them both look out into the life again. Maeve's smile didn't feel like an accusation anymore. It felt like a witness, proof that he'd lived long enough to go soft. Spring came slow to Tibbs Harbor, the way it always does, with green whispers under the last of the snow and meltwater running off the rooftops in silver threads, and the ice going out of the bay in great groaning plates. Beacon broadened through the chest and steadied on his legs, though one ear still kept its crooked fold. A small memory of the frightened scrap he'd been. The harbor still called him the talking dog, and after the night at the slip they called him a hero besides, and he took both titles with the noble seriousness of a creature who understood a saved scrap of Teuton far better than he understood fame. Eamon changed in quieter ways. He still rose before light and kept his boots squared by the door and put his back to the wall in a crowded room. Some nights the wind still hauled him out of sleep with his heart going, but there were chewed-up toys by the Chesterfield now, and muddy paw prints on the step, and a photograph standing up on the sill, and the little carved sign by the door that asked the world to speak soft. On a bright Saturday, Dr. Robin Pike came by with her camera, the one she used at the clinic to photograph the mended ones, not for the files, she liked to say, for proof that mercy leaves a mark. She caught Beacon asleep under the kitchen table, with his head pillowed on Eamon's old faded gloves, the gloves that had once meant cold metal and closed fists, now turned to a cushion for the dog that had pulled the man back toward the living. The shutter clicked. Nobody spoke for a moment. Lorne pretended hard to study the woodpile through the window, and Effie blew her nose into a tea towel. That's the whole of it, isn't it? Dr. Pike said softly. Eamon looked at the dog at the collar, at Atlas's worn tag resting against the silver fur, and answered, "Most of it, maid, most of it." That evening, with the last gold of the sun gone down behind the long range, and the harbour pricked out below in scattered lights, each little window a small human star, Eamon stepped out onto the back stoop, and Beacon came and sat against his leg without being asked. He laid one hand on the dog's neck and felt the strong, calm pulse under the fur and the leather. He remembered the first night, the gale, the crate, the frozen bowl, the heartbeat fluttering under his coat like a candle nearly out. That same heart was thunder now, steady and sure. "I thought I was bringing you home," he said. Beacon looked up at him, pale eyes catching the porch light. Turns out it was the other way about. And under those stars over the strait, the old soldier finally felt the one thing the desert and the long 11 months in the cancer ward had taken between them. Not victory, not escape. Home. In the end, perhaps the wonder of it was not only that a hard man hauled a frightened pup out of a frozen crate, or that a half-drowned animal learned to lift his voice over a Newfoundland pond. Perhaps the real wonder was quieter than that. That grace still comes down through our plainest days in the smallest of disguises. In a message on a stormy night, in a creature trembling behind wire, in a neighbour's plate of Teutons, in a cold nose pressed careful to an old scar, in a heartbeat that reminds a person, against all the evidence he's gathered, that he was never as alone as he believed. The winter inside a man doesn't lift all at once. It goes the way the mountain snow goes, drop by drop, day by day, under a patient sun. So if any part of this found a soft place in you tonight, share it with somebody who could use a little hope. And tell us, down below, about the animal, or the person, or the small ordinary miracle that carried you through your own hard season. We read everyone. Subscribe if you'd like more stories of loyalty, faith, and the long road home. And may God keep you, and your family, and your house, and every gentle soul who has ever loved an animal and been loved right back.